All right, now we come to the last of the recaps, the recap for week 13. I won't recap week 14 because it's a bonus week, and I mean it is important to understand week 14, and hopefully I explained it pretty well in the lecture for that week. But yeah, I don't think that there's sort of time for me to do a recap and for everyone to look at it. I will mention some tie-ins to week 14 in this week 13 recap. So hopefully that will be illuminating. So this is kind of going to be a week 13 and 14 recap, but we're going to focus primarily on week 13, obviously. So the topic this week kind of follows on a little bit from the topic for last week. It's still in the general realm of political philosophy, and we're looking at the idea of state authority. So the philosophical and political positions which question state authority en masse, that is entirely, are various forms of anarchism. So in the Wolff argument that you did for the reading sequence, he's putting forward a particular view, a particular version of anarchism, philosophical anarchism, and defending it. The article that we looked at, or excuse me, the argument that we looked at in the presentation slides for week 13 was not anarchism per se, but simply about rejecting the moral authority of the state to tax people. And that was an argument by Robert Nozick, the same person who was responsible for the Wilt Chamberlain argument. And Robert Nozick did not advocate sort of total political anarchy. He advocated a sort of minimal state, libertarian state, in which all it does is kind of protect you from foreign invaders and ensure the enforcement of contracts, which contracts were all drawn up between willing parties, and so the state didn't do much other than that, but it existed. Wolff's argument isn't against the existence of a state per se, but argues instead about what responsibility individuals have with respect to the state and the proclamations of that state. So Nozick's argument, as I said, is against taxation in particular. It is sort of comparing taxation to slavery, essentially. And there's not much more to say about it. I went pretty in-depth in the actual lecture talking about the various difficulties with Nozick's argument. In general, if you'll recall, I said that the argument, even if it is valid, which it might not be, is fairly clearly unsound because Nozick draws a conclusion about all taxes that they are ways of forcing the individual to work more, to work against their will in order to no benefit, for no benefit to themselves. That was a difficult sentence. But of course, there is almost no one, we argued, in at least a state like the United States or any liberal democracy where the taxes don't benefit pretty much everyone. The taxes go to infrastructure maintenance, so on and so forth. In fact, I didn't mention this, almost ironically, it's as you move towards more privatized infrastructure that the taxes are going to benefit fewer and fewer people because they might not use a particular service, and so if they pay taxes which support it, and so on and so forth, it's not going to be of any use to them. So in a certain sense, Nozick's argument is only true as we sort of approach a state which is more like the one that he envisions. And so that would be a pretty severe and bizarre flaw in his argument if I'm actually right about that. But sort of returning to a more conservative critique, because as it goes in most places where there is taxation, almost everyone benefits from it, then Nozick's argument, even if it is valid, just doesn't work, because it requires that the citizens who are being taxed see no benefit from it, right? He talks about so-and-so being taxed in order to support the needy and not receiving any benefit themselves, because the person paying the tax, the person paying taxes in general, Nozick is assuming, is not needy. Again, that's also kind of not true. People who are in some way below the poverty line are still going to be paying taxes. Maybe they get all of their income tax back after it's withheld. But when they buy anything at all, they're going to be paying sales tax. It's basically impossible to avoid paying taxes without doing, illegal things. So for that reason, Nozick's argument is fairly clearly unsound, and it might be invalid because it moves from sort of premises about certain types of taxes to all taxes, and that's sort of a hasty generalization, so on and so forth. So we don't need to talk too much more about that one. It's all in the original presentation. I do want to talk a little bit more about Wolff's argument. So anarchy, when you hear that word, you probably think of a lack of order, a lack of functioning government, sort of chaos in the streets, etc., etc. But in a philosophical context, in a political philosophical context, anarchy doesn't imply that, doesn't entail that at all. So in Wolff's argument, philosophical anarchy, this argument would be true regardless of the actual type of state that you find yourself in. So you could find yourself in a very sort of restrictive dictatorship, and Wolff's argument would still be true, right? It's not saying that any certain form of government is sort of the best. It's instead saying that regardless of the form of government, the laws which are put forward are not morally binding on any individual. Or I should say, they are not morally binding because they are laws. Basically, Wolff's argument is every person has to follow in a certain sense, their conscience, right? You must decide what you are going to do. And you must decide it on the basis of your own interests, moral compass, etc. Now, if that happens to align with the laws, that's perfectly fine. Wolff is also not arguing that you should sort of reject and break the laws simply because they're the laws. It's not this reactionary sort of petulant teenage rebellion anarchy, right? It's, well, you have to do what you think is right. If that coincides with the laws, great. If it goes against the laws, well, so much the worse for the laws. So the laws have they create no obligations for us, according to Wolff. The obligations that we have have some other moral source, and he's arguing in favor of autonomy, right? He's saying that to be autonomous is essentially to make our decisions for ourselves, and accepting anyone else's authority, the states, the churches, your partners, your bosses, whatever, accepting anyone else's authority and letting them make decisions for you, as it were, doing something simply because they told you to, is sort of you're harming your own interests. In fact, you're violating your obligations to yourself, is the way that Wolff puts it. So this position is not totally idiosyncratic to Wolff. Outside of this kind of political context, you get arguments that are kind of like this from existentialists like Sartre, who we saw in the free will debate. So Sartre, if you recall, said that humans are inescapably free, and that we are free despite the fact that our actions are in some way causally determined, because decisions and motivations for acting are sort of outside the realm of physical causes. Sartre sort of elaborates on this at other points that aren't in the argument that you saw, and says that if, in spite of your radical freedom, as he calls it, you kind of allow someone else to dictate your decisions, you sort of say to yourself, well, I'm not really free because, physics determines what I do, or I'm not really free because the state has authority over me. You are living in bad faith, right? You are sort of offloading your responsibility onto someone else, and this is bad somehow, right? Wolff's argument is similar to that. He's saying, look, if you give, because that's the only way that someone else would have authority over you, if you give another person, an institution, authority over you, you are violating your obligations to yourself to be autonomous, to be self-determined. So this type of argument shows up in more than one place in philosophy, this idea that we have to make our own way. Not just that it's better to make our own way, but that it is bad to not do it. So the conclusion of Wolff's argument is that we should not accept authority of the law, and that is only one of the conclusions that he could have, because he says if we accept, we should not accept the authority of others, is what he's saying. And the law is simply one of the many others whose authority we could accept. As I mentioned earlier, this would tell us to reject the authority of any institution, basically, whether it be state or private or otherwise. So that's what anarchy means in this context, is not a disorder, not chaos, but simply a rejection of the authority of anyone by any individual of any other individual. So me, I shouldn't accept your authority. You shouldn't accept my authority. Neither of us should accept the state's authority. But of course, again, that is consistent with us being perfectly law-abiding citizens, right? A state whose laws aligned perfectly with my own interests, aligned perfectly with what I would do anyway, is a state whose laws I will all follow. Now, if at some point in time those laws cease to be in line with my interest because the laws change, or if my interests change because, whatever reason, and the laws don't, in either one of those situations, it would be morally acceptable for me to cease following those laws, to cease conforming to those laws. And that's sort of the view that Wolff is putting forward. So hopefully that clears some things up. I did see in the discussion lots of people were saying that being autonomous is consistent with the authority of the law. Just make sure that when you're thinking that, you're not simply meaning that being autonomous is consistent with following the law, right? So again, as I said, you could follow the laws in the sense of not break them and still be autonomous and still not accept the laws have authority over you. You would still be acting autonomously in that way. What Wolff is saying is that the minute that you follow the law because it's the law, you've ceased to be autonomous. You have given authority over to some other institution, and you shouldn't do that. Now, as the book indicates, it's not exactly clear if there's a consistent view of autonomy that can work all throughout Wolff's argument, and so the argument may end up being invalid due to equivocation. It has to talk about multiple senses of autonomy across its various premises, and in that case, when it talks about the need to reject authority, it's not on solid ground. So hopefully that clears all that up. Now I said I would briefly relate this to the week 14 stuff. In week 14, you will have looked at the Euthyphro argument, and in that presentation, I talk about this order of analysis issue, which arises from the Euthyphro problem, and that is the idea of whether something is good because the gods love it, or whether the gods love something because it's good, right? Which one of those things is doing the conceptual work? The independent goodness of some action, of some state of affairs, which independent goodness causes the gods to love it because they have, proper judgment and they see, oh, this is good on its own, therefore I love it. Or is it that the loving of the gods is the conceptually prior thing, and that the attitudes of the gods determine whether something is good? It's not good on its own, it's only good if the gods love it. So you have to ask, which direction do things flow? You can ask sort of a similar question here with the law. Is something right to do because the law says so, or does the law say something is right to, you should do something because it's good to do, right? And so Wolff is saying, look, the law is correct only if it tells you to do what you would have already done anyway. Now, we don't have a clear picture of whether Wolff thinks that everyone's good, everyone's well-being is more or less the same, and so that there could be a single set of laws which was in the interest of every person or not. He doesn't talk about that. It's very unlikely that Wolff is going to be saying something to that effect. So it doesn't look possible that there could be a single set of laws which would happen to tell everyone to do what they were already going to do, unless everyone was exactly the same, and so that's just not the way things are. But once again, this order of analysis issue sort of is fruitful for understanding the nature of the argument. So once again, to repeat, the question, the order of analysis question in Wolff's argument is something legal because it's right, or is something right because it's legal? Wolff rejects the second one. Wolff says that something will never be right simply because it's legal. He's going to say things which are already right, if they're legal, then that's fine. I mean, he's not even necessarily saying something that strong. He doesn't think that something being right for me makes it legal. He just thinks it makes it what I should do. If a law happens to coincide with what is right for you, then great, follow it. If not, don't follow it. So hopefully that clears things up a little bit. That draws a little bit of a connection between this stuff in week 13 and then the stuff in week 14, which is about the foundations of morality. And again, there won't be a separate recap for week 14, as it is bonus material, and sort of we're at the end of the term and there's just a frenzy of activity. So if you do have any questions about it, you can feel free to email me. But otherwise, we're done, and as usual, I hope that this was a helpful recap for you.